Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Margaret Palmer, Director of SUSINC, and I welcomed you in the chat box, but I want to welcome you face-to-face or something like that. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker. Dr. Tu Nguyen is an environmental and natural resource economist. Her research applies economic methods to understand the complex trade-offs between development, conservation, and restoration. And this is in land, coastal, and ocean management. Right now, she's an Ocean Nexus Fellow at Dalhousie University in Canada, where she works with the Ocean Nexus Center, and she's looking at the economic impact of COVID-19 on fisheries. But before that, she received her PhD in applied economics at Oregon State, and there she was working on non-market benefits of restoring sandy beach and coastal dune landscapes. She's well-versed in interdisciplinary collaboration through her role in a NOAA-funded project, which was focused on, or the title was, a multidisciplinary integrative approach to valuing ecosystem services from natural infrastructure. What's really fun is that she's not a stranger to SUSINC. She's a former graduate research fellow with SUSINC, and her pursuit team explored the shifting benefits of marine protected areas under climate change. And their first results were published last year in PLOS One. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome you again too, and feel free to share your screen and start presenting.
Thank you, Margaret, and thanks for the introduction. I was a SUSINC fellow, so I'm really happy to be back here. So the motivation behind this research for myself and my colleagues was obviously the pandemic. Over the past year, all our lives have changed dramatically, and my colleagues and myself decided to direct our work in environmental and natural resources towards a population that is very central to my research, which is fishery workers, so the people who work in harvesting and processing. And today I'll be talking about the economic impact of the pandemic on fishery workers in Canada. We chose to focus on Canada for a few reasons, one of which was that I live here, even though I believe the insights are appropriate and applicable in a broader context as well. And thank you for SUSINC and Ocean Nexus Center for enabling the research and enabling me to be here today. Just a little bit on the context. We all know what happened at this point. The pandemic was first reported in December 2019 and quickly spread all over the world. On March 11, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, and on March 18, Canada, which is the location of my study, closed its borders and shut down everything that was not essential. Now, fishing was considered essential and thus was able to continue working and operating. But as you may or may not know, seafood is the most globally traded food group in terms of revenue by a long shot, as you can see from the bottom bar of this graph. Its export values exceeds that of all the other sources of protein put together. So for something that relies so heavily on international trade like fisheries, COVID meant a lot of challenges. The supply chain was completely disrupted when borders were closed and stay-at-home orders were put out. A lot of seafood that Canada exports is fresh and perishable, so the restrictions meant that a lot of seafood had problems getting to their destinations fast enough. And on the demand side, demand for fresh seafood completely collapsed due to the closure of restaurants, the shutdown of tourism, and as well as in-person celebrations. And seafood is considered a luxury rather than a necessity in Canada as well as the US, where Canada mainly exports seafood too. So when the pandemic happened and the recession followed, really demand for seafood just dramatically reduced. Although demand for some canned and frozen and non-perishable seafood did increase a little bit due to people cooking more at home. So I guess just briefly touching on the environmental context is that some fish stocks actually saw lower fishing pressure due to lower demand. But in other parts of the world, unfortunately, we saw an increase in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So when all of these things were happening in fisheries, to the market, to the stocks, shipping, et cetera, we got to wondering, what about the people, and primarily the workers that work in fisheries, harvesting and processing? That led my colleagues and myself to asking, how are they doing? The fishery workers in Canada experience economic insecurity during the pandemic, and what factors contribute to their economic insecurity as well as their overall well-being, whether they are receiving government financial assistance, and does that seem to help at all? So why fishery workers, and why do we care? Besides the fact that they contribute to producing and shipping this really important food source to all of us. Now, the reason why I was so interested in this population is that there are distinct characteristics of working in fisheries that sets these workers apart from the labor force as a whole. A lot of research about the labor force in general doesn't really apply to this sector for several reasons. One is that a high proportion of fishery workers are self-employed, so they don't earn a regular wage, nor can they apply for government assistance when eligibility is based often on salary or wages. Now we see a little bit more of self-employment in the gig economy, but traditionally labor economics mostly focuses on wage-earning employees. The income is really seasonal, so they can earn the entire year's worth of income in a few weeks or maximum a few months. And the income is also highly precarious, because weather dependent, and overall they have few protection. For example, they can't really get insurance against bad weather the same way that farmers can. So overall, I feel like this population deserves a look into their financial and overall well-being during the pandemic, because they might experience economic insecurity at even a greater rate than the general workforce. Now in Canada, and we chose Canada partly because we had to bound the study somehow, even though the impact is felt worldwide. Fisheries in Canada occur on both coasts. The demographic of workers on both coasts are similar, though the species they catch differ. So we have lobster on the East Coast and salmon on the West Coast. For example, the size of businesses, the resource management approaches might be different between different areas. Having said that, most of the financial assistance programs are set at the federal level. That means that it's a little bit more uniform in Canada compared to the US, where a lot of decisions on who can get what kind of money is left up to the state to decide. So that's another reason why we chose Canada. In terms of the pandemic, there was a lot of delay in terms of getting financial assistance to fishery workers. And this is another reason why we felt like it's important to look into this population. So in March 2020, as soon as the pandemic was declared, the Canadian federal government introduced several emergency responses for the workforce, and that was effective immediately, meaning that people with earning employees could apply for assistance and get it right away. Now, a lot of, again, fishery workers are self-employed, so they couldn't access this kind of money. And it wasn't until May 2020 where the programs for fishery specific was announced. And it wasn't until August 2020 that they could apply for it, and until the end of the year that they could receive it. So there was a serious delay between when the fishery workers encounter, I guess, economic hardship and when they could receive money, especially considering that a lot of seafood was exported to China. So some of these workers experienced reduced income as early as late 2019, January 2020. So before going into more detail about what we find, I just mentioned briefly two strands of literature that enable us to do this project. The first is about state of fishery workers in 2020. Most notably, Smith and colleagues explored the adaptations and resilience of commercial fishers in the northeastern US in the early stages of the pandemic between March and June 2020. And they found that nearly all experienced a loss of income, but they continue fishing anyway, and they adapted by switching to direct sales, selling domestically, locally, as well as supplemented their income with government payments. The second strand of literature I'll mention briefly is the on literature of economic insecurity. So although it's an important issue, interestingly, there is no clear consensus of how to quantify economic insecurity, unlike other measures of economic well-being, such as inequality, poverty, for which there are clear definitions and ways to measure. So perhaps the most cited definition of economic insecurity is the lack of economic safety and the anxiety that comes with it. And when I was canvassing and studying the literature, there are usually two types of measures that can be used to address the level of economic insecurity. The first is objective measures such as unemployment, as well as the lack of health insurance. And the subjective measures could be things like the feeling of job security, whether the individuals feel like they have job security, and their own feeling of financial satisfaction. So applying these two strands of literature, we went ahead and conducted an online survey of fishery workers in Canada. The survey was distributed online in January 2021, which allows for workers to finish the entire year of 2020 and see the impact that the pandemic has on their annual income. Workers in both harvesting and processing are included in the study population, although those in aquaculture are not included, partly because their income is a bit more stable and they are considered somewhat as a cross-section between fisheries and aquaculture. So the characteristics of this group might be a bit different, and they only make up of a very small percentage of workers in the industry, so we decided not to include them. So our survey starts with a set of subjective questions, which are placed first, obviously, to avoid ordering effects and introducing biases to the respondents. The survey starts by asking people, how satisfied are you with your lives these days? And how satisfied are you with your overall level of income and wealth? Now, these sound really, really simple, but it has been shown to be a fairly accurate measure of subjective well-being. And we follow that with a few more subjective questions of people's opinions and feelings. We also include objective questions concerning people's work experience, employment status, whether they apply to and access any form of government aids, as well as demographic questions. So with that said, we did a survey. We got 82 completed responses. The respondents are heavily skewed towards harvester, and the sample is representative of harvester in terms of age, gender, income, and geographical location. So we got people from different parts of the country. But compared to the fishery labor force, which includes the processing group fishery workers, the sample is obviously older and more heavily male because of a lot of workers in processing plants are women. Now, the relatively small sample size means that we were not able to conduct a ton of rigorous statistical analysis because of a small sample size. So just keep that in mind. So just to preview what we are going to find when we ask people how do you feel about your life? How satisfied are you with your life these days? On the scale of 1 to 10, the median well-being of respondents is 7, and the most frequently selected answer was 8. So a fun fact is that across hundreds and hundreds of studies that have been done about subjective well-being in different countries, across different populations, and with different research questions, the answer seems to always hover around 7. So it wasn't really surprising. And when we asked respondents of their financial satisfaction on the scale of 1 to 10, the mean and the median both hover around 3 out of 5. And next, when we asked respondents whether they agree or disagree with a number of statements of economic insecurity, looking both at the year 2020, at the current situation, as well as the future. Reflecting on 2020, most reported that they are worse off now than before the pandemic started. Most again stated that 2020 was not a good year, and as the pandemic has negatively affected their income and wealth. Looking at the present, about 2/3 agree or strongly agree that they could easily pay for the basic needs, but almost half reported that they might have trouble paying for an unexpected major expense. Now, when we ask people or respondents about the upcoming year, the outlook is quite evenly split, which we have slightly more respondents thinking that 2021 will be a good year economically, and fairly equal proportions agree or disagree that they might have trouble making ends meet in 2021. So overall, even though the impact is felt quite heterogeneously, and the answer, we have a distribution in all of the questions, so overall consensus seems to be that yes, the effect hasn't been, they're not doing super well. Now, looking at factors that affected their income, most respondents cite the ability to pay business loans as their biggest economic concern, which is evident because of the majority of the fact that the majority of respondents are self-employed harvesters, and thus they have business loans to pay and a lot of business expenses. Most also cited lower demand as a primary reason for the reduced income, if they experience reduced income at all in 2020. This is consistent with the findings from Smith and colleagues of the northeastern US fishers, and lower demand is of a much bigger concern compared to other reasons like physical distancing rules or having to take care of family members. In terms of employment, most of people or respondents reported that they continue fishing. Only less than 10% quit or lost their job or decided not to go fishing altogether. Even though that over half of the majority did report working fewer hours than before, which is unsurprising, citing the reason of having lower demand for seafood. Quite a considerable portion reported that they are currently unemployed, but that's mainly due to their fishing being out of season. So most respondents, over 80%, applied and received some form of government assistance, including both programs for the labor force in general, as well as fisheries-specific programs. Now, although mostly everyone received some kind of government assistance, I was curious and I just did a very simple correlation check, and I found that there's virtually no difference, correlation between receiving government money and life satisfaction or financial satisfaction. Some respondents reported that they had to turn to personal savings as an adaptation strategies. Some obviously turned to direct sales, selling locally, but not many have left fishery altogether. I think almost nobody did, which is not entirely surprising because fisheries is a very sticky business, especially if you're in harvesting. It requires a lot of cost to enter and exit. So one bad year unlikely will turn people or respondents away from the industry altogether. So slightly overhyped, we're able to access general COVID government assistance for the general workforce. Employment insurance is something that was always there for fishery workers when they did not receive income out of season. And the terms and conditions, so to speak, were altered during the pandemic to become more generous to assist workers. And the last row here is the fish harvester benefit and grant. It was a fishery specific type of emergency response. Now, it's worth noting that even though the majority seem to be able to access some source of financial assistance, some of them were able to access multiple sources. It's worth knowing that a lot of wage subsidies or emergency assistance that came out with COVID have eligibility that requires people to submit their prior year income. So the new entrants in the market were not eligible to receive any of this. So that was the look at the data, and to understand what might have contributed to respondents' overall well-being and financial satisfaction, I ran some OLS regression. I find that the single most important factor that accounts for life satisfaction is the ability to meet basic needs, which is one of the indicators of economic insecurity. Meeting basic needs increases their life satisfaction substantially. Another factor is whether the pandemic has had a negative effect on the respondents' overall wealth and income. If they experienced reduced income, that reduces their life satisfaction. Now, interestingly, unemployment is not a significant variable, although the literature has found that unemployment is one of the most important factors that determine one's subjective well-being. The explanation for this is possibly unemployment in the fishery context is very much expected. Workers go out and fish for a few months, and for the rest of the year, they receive some form of employment insurance. So it's by design rather than, like say, being laid off from a job that you receive a regular salary from. Another possible explanation is that the literature has also found the negative effect of unemployment on well-being is largely mitigated by generous unemployment benefits. So that may be what's going on here. And we find that demographic variables are not really significant, nor do they add explanatory power to the regressions. I also ran regression with the dependent variable being financial satisfaction and with a few different independent variables. Again, because of the small sample size, there's a limit on how many variables I could include in the regression. So respondents reported that working less in 2020 had negatively affected the financial satisfaction. And again, having basic needs met tremendously increases their financial satisfaction. Again, unemployment is not significant, and including it in the model doesn't really increase explanatory power of the model. And the reasons are probably the same as previously, that unemployment here is very expected, it's by design, and that there are respondents and workers as a whole expect to receive some form of employment insurance in the months that they're not working, so they can still meet their needs. None of the demographic variables are significant in contributing to financial satisfaction except for education level. So those who have some type of college education reported higher financial satisfaction, even though objectively speaking, we did not detect a substantial difference in terms of income between those who have some college education and those who don't. And the final thing I would say with these regressions is that I only include a couple of demographic variables to show that including them doesn't really increase the explanatory power of the model. But I did check all of the demographic variables in different specifications. So I checked age, gender, marital status, whether the respondents have children, whether they have how many children they have, etc., etc. And none of those variables are as powerful as having their basic needs met, which has a tremendous and positive impact on their well-being, and working less than the prior year has a negative impact on the financial well-being. So since the study is still preliminary, as far as the next steps go, the good news is that the federal government of Canada has released some data on employment as well as sector-specific metrics in 2020. That means that we will be able to obtain more data on unemployment, the number of employment insurance claims, the number of people who were able to access, and the amount of money that was given out during the pandemic as financial assistance. And that will enable us to conduct more quantitative analysis. Now, the survey is part of a bigger project where we want to understand the level and sources of economic insecurity among fishery workers, as well as how policies can be designed to make them more resilient against external shocks. Because COVID is probably seen as one of a lifetime thing, but fisheries generally are vulnerable to quite a few different types of shocks, including environmental, economic, and others. So I think I'm probably going close to the half an hour mark here. There are some key takeaways of the study so far. We find that fishery workers in Canada experience some economic insecurity that became very evident in the pandemic. It's possible that fishery workers are vulnerable to shocks in general, and the income and economic insecurity is not generally good overall, but the pandemic made that even worse. Although the impact was heterogeneous, so it differed, different workers were impacted differently. Their economic insecurity likely was unaddressed by traditional measures. By that I mean including unemployment as a variable doesn't really fully capture people, fishery workers' economic insecurity, because unemployment is seen very differently and understood very differently in the fishery context compared to someone who earns a regular wage every week, every month. And a lot of COVID assistance, financial assistance that was designed and distributed to the general workforce, fishery workers couldn't access them. So there was a huge delay between 6 months and a year between when the financial aid for general workforce became available and when fishery workers could access financial assistance that they were eligible for. So the 6 month to a year delay was very serious, especially if the workers were struggling in the first place. And the most important factors to life and financial satisfaction is the ability for workers to meet their basic needs, whether that is through employment or employment insurance or any other form. So I want to end the presentation here. I want to thank the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center for allowing me to do this research for funding. And thank you for listening to having me here. And I also included my email and my Twitter handle on the screen. If you want to get in touch later, I'm always happy to chat everything environmental and natural resources. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much for an interesting seminar. We really appreciate it. And I know that Nicole Motzer, who invited you, is sorry she's not here, but she's got a brand new little baby, so that's exciting. We do have several questions too, so I'll just read those to you. Katie Peterson writes, really interesting research, thank you. Could you elaborate more regarding your point about fishers experiencing one bad year will potentially exit the industry completely? That seems counter to the fact that it's difficult to enter and exit the industry. Do you think some of these fishers return to the industry after a few years? And in general, what are some feasible alternative livelihoods for them?
Thank you. I think there might be a misunderstanding in this. I did say that fishery is very sticky, so there's high cost of entering and exiting. And I believe that one bad year does not cause fisheries or fishery workers to exit the industry. And the survey results do show that most people did stick around and continue fishing. Some chose to wait a year because it wasn't worth going out, in the sense that the demand was so low that they weren't confident they would sell the stuff. But generally, most, if not all of them, stay in fisheries, even though they might take a year off. In terms of alternative livelihood, that's a very interesting and difficult question that I don't have. Honestly, I don't have good answers to. And I'll say that in fishery economics, it makes me very furious that usually our models say, oh, fishers can either choose to fish or they can choose to do something else, and it's never clear like what the something else is. I think the presence of employment insurance in Canada is to ensure that they are able to pursue this livelihood, even though if we were left to the complete free market, it might not be viable. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for alternative livelihoods.
Okay, that's great. We have more questions. So Rachel Mason asked, can you give a few specific examples of the kinds of shocks that fisheries and their workers are vulnerable to? And do your results from this project or others already point to ways of increasing resilience to them?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I'm actually working on a paper that sort of zoom out from the pandemic and studying how fishery can be more resilient to shocks in general. So there's demand shocks, which could happen when, let's say, either pandemic or non-pandemic, people stop eating fish for a reason. There are supply shocks that happens when most often when there's an environmental issue, like an oil spill or a stock collapse. And there's also like policy shocks. Let's say if a new policy is introduced that completely changes the way fisheries are allowed to operate. The other part of the question was?
The other part was, do your results already point to ways of increasing resilience?
Yeah, I think some of it to an extent is still pretty early, but I think one way is that just jumped out at me was that when a shock that hit everybody like COVID happened, people who were wage earning workers, like grocery store workers or like service workers, were able to access a lot of financial support immediately, and that didn't become available to fishery workers. And it almost seemed like an afterthought that the government put out these financial packages and they realized, oh wait, the fishery sector were completely left out, and now we have to design a package just for them. So just, I think just keeping them in mind, and perhaps having programs in place that can deploy financial aid, perhaps more timely, would really help. There might be other ways, but that remains to be studied.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment you made about them. Oh, yeah, we left them out. It's sort of indicative of the chaos of this whole COVID crisis, that it seems like it's been very confusing in many ways. So one more question, Rachel Zurcher asked, your talk really made me think of similar challenges that California has struggled with, resulting from closure of the Dungeness crab fishery due to HABs, harmful algal blooms related toxicity. So it strikes me that these challenges are likely occurring at various scales in fisheries all over the world. In your research, have you come across bright spots, places where you think the response to an externality such as a pandemic has worked out especially well?
Thank you. Okay, that's a great question because, well, several reasons. One, because I did my PhD in Oregon State, so I'm somewhat familiar with the Dungeness crab fisheries on the West Coast, and with the incident. Another thing is that I think that question is exactly what I'm trying to answer, and I'm currently doing a literature review on where, what the responses to external shocks are and where they have worked well. Part of the challenges is defining what working well means. And you're absolutely right that in fisheries, a negative shock occurs honestly every 5 to 10 years. And probably might be different species. It wouldn't be something as all-encompassing as COVID, but something at a smaller scale occurs quite often.
Interesting. Well, I can't help asking, is potentially a bright spot that the fishery is doing better, that is the populations?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is it possible that a bright spot is that because of reduced fishing, the fish populations are doing better, the lobster and salmon?
Yeah, from the viewpoint of conservation, possibly, yeah. But yes, I think that's one challenge, is to define like what is working well, what is like for whom, for the fish or for the people, and whatnot.
Yeah, a classic question in socio-environmental research: who wins and who loses from this or that. Well, thank you so much for a really interesting seminar. We appreciate you taking the time, and I'm glad it's spring there in Dalhousie. That region can be quite cold, and wish you the best of luck as you move forward this year with your work.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here today.